They say children are your insurance policy for old age, but I learned that some policies never pay out when you need them most. I'm Ingrid, born in 1951 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Back in 1975, when I was 24 and newly married to Carl, we made a decision that would define our entire lives. We chose freedom over family, careers over cribs, and independence over everything else. I felt so certain then, so proud of our unconventional path. But then something happened that shattered everything I thought I knew about growing old alone. Carl and I were the golden couple of our generation. While our friends were changing diapers and losing sleep, we were climbing corporate ladders and exploring Europe. We had matching his and hers BMWs, a pristine house with white carpets, and bank accounts that grew fatter each year. When people asked about children, we'd exchange that knowing look and recite our rehearsed response. We're too selfish to be good parents. It always got a laugh, deflecting the uncomfortable questions about when we'd settle down and start a real family. The pressure was relentless, especially from our mothers. Carl's mom would leave baby magazines on our coffee table during visits, sighing dramatically as she flipped through photos of chubby-cheeked infants. My mother was more direct, cornering me in the kitchen during family gatherings. "Ingrid, you're not getting any younger," she'd whisper urgently. "What if something happens to Carl? Who will take care of you?" I'd roll my eyes and change the subject, but her words planted seeds of doubt that I refused to acknowledge. One evening in 1982, Carl came home from a business trip looking unusually thoughtful. He'd sat next to a young mother on the plane, he told me, watching her struggle with a screaming toddler while juggling a baby and diaper bag. "She looked so overwhelmed," he said quietly. But when the baby finally fell asleep in her arms, her whole face changed. She looked complete. For the first time in our 7-year marriage, we had a real conversation about children. Not the dismissive jokes or practical concerns, but the deep, vulnerable truth about what we might be missing. That night, we held each other closer than we had in months, both of us sensing we were at a crossroads. But by morning, the moment had passed. We doubled down on our choice, booking a 3-week vacation to Thailand and putting a down payment on a vacation home in Colorado. We were living proof that a child-free life could be rich and fulfilling. We had everything we wanted, and we convinced ourselves that was enough. The years flew by in a blur of promotions, dinner parties, and exotic vacations. We were the couple everyone envied, successful, attractive, and seemingly carefree. But as we entered our 60s, the questions stopped coming. People no longer asked about children. They assumed we'd made our peace with our decision. What they didn't see were the quiet moments when Carl would linger at the code playground during our evening walks, or how I'd find myself staring at family photos in restaurants, wondering what our children might have looked like. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, everything changed. Carl collapsed in our kitchen while making coffee, gone before the paramedics arrived. 68 years old, and just like that, I was alone. The funeral was well-attended, colleagues, neighbors, golf buddies, but as I stood by his casket, I realized something terrifying. Everyone there would go home to their families, their children and grandchildren. I would go home to silence. The months that followed were a blur of grief and practical arrangements. I tried to maintain our old routines, but everything felt hollow without Carl's laughter filling the house. Friends invited me to dinner parties, but I felt like a third wheel, the odd woman out in a world designed for couples and families. The loneliness was suffocating, but I told myself I was strong enough to handle it. After all, independence had been my choice, my pride. The fall happened 6 months after Carl's death. I was reaching for a book on a high shelf when the ladder slipped, sending me crashing to the hardwood floor. My hip shattered on impact, and I lay there for 3 hours before a neighbor found me. The hospital stay was a revelation, not the medical kind, but a social one. I watched other patients receive streams of visitors, Children bringing grandchildren, spouses holding hands, families gathering around bedsides with flowers and homemade cookies. My room remained empty except for a few colleagues and neighbors who felt obligated to stop by. The nurses were kind but busy, and I began to understand something that chilled me to the bone. In a medical setting, your worth seemed directly tied to how many people cared enough to visit. Patients with large families got extra attention, longer conversations, more compassionate care. Those of us alone were processed efficiently but without warmth. That's when I made the decision that I thought was responsible and forward-thinking. I would move into a high-end assisted living facility, while I was still healthy enough to choose. I researched extensively, visiting Golden Years Manor, a beautiful facility with manicured gardens and five-star dining. The marketing materials promised dignity, community, and professional care. I signed the papers and moved in, convinced I was being proactive about my future. The first week was pleasant enough. The staff was professional, the food was decent, and my apartment was comfortable. But as days turned into weeks, I began to notice the hierarchy that governed life in the facility. Residents with frequent family visitors were treated like royalty. Staff members lingered to chat. Activities were planned around their preferences, and their complaints were addressed immediately. Those of us without regular visitors became invisible, our needs secondary to those who had advocates. I watched Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter visited daily, receive extra portions at dinner and priority scheduling for the physical therapist. Meanwhile, Mr. Chan, whose family lived across the country, waited weeks for a maintenance request to fix his broken air conditioning. The message was clear: your value as a human being was measured by how much your family cared, or at least how much they appeared to care. After 2 months at Golden Years Manor, I couldn't take another day of being treated like a forgotten piece of furniture. I packed my bags and returned to the house Carl and I had shared, determined to age in place with dignity. If I was going to be alone, at least I'd be alone in my own home, surrounded by memories that still held warmth. But independence, I was about to learn, came with a price I hadn't calculated. I hired Margaret through a reputable agency, a woman in her 50s who came with glowing references and a warm smile during our interview. She was supposed to help with cleaning, cooking, and basic companionship, nothing too demanding, just enough support to keep me safe and comfortable. The first red flag should have been how quickly she agreed to my generous salary offer, but I was desperate for human connection and willing to pay premium prices for quality care. Margaret's true nature revealed itself within days. She'd arrive late, leave early, and spend most of her time on her phone while I struggled with simple tasks. When I asked her to help me organize Carl's belongings, she rolled her eyes and muttered about rich old ladies and their problems. The meals she prepared were barely edible frozen dinners heated in the microwave, stale bread, and coffee so weak it looked like tea. When I gently suggested improvements, she'd snap that I was too picky and threatened to quit. The breaking point came when I fell in the bathroom one evening. I called for Margaret, who was supposed to be in the guest room, but got no response. I managed to pull myself up using the towel rack, my shoulder screaming in pain, only to discover she'd left hours earlier without telling me. I spent the night alone, terrified and hurting, realizing that my expensive caregiver cared more about her paycheck than my well-being. I fired her the next morning, but the damage was done. I felt more vulnerable and isolated than ever. That's when David called. My son, the child I'd given birth to but never really mothered the way he deserved. He was 43 now, a successful architect living in Seattle with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage daughters. We spoke maybe 3 times a year, polite conversations that skimmed the surface of our lives without diving into the deep waters of our complicated relationship. But somehow he'd heard about my struggles through the neighborhood grapevine. "Mom, Jennifer and I are coming to visit," he said during that awkward phone call. "We're worried about you." I wanted to protest, to insist I was fine, but the words stuck in my throat. Part of me was desperate for their company, even if it came wrapped in obligation rather than genuine affection. They arrived on a Saturday morning, David looking so much like Carl it took my breath away. Jennifer polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. We sat in my living room, the same room where Carl and I had entertained countless guests over the years, and tried to have a conversation that felt more like a business meeting than a family reunion. David asked practical questions about my finances, my health, my plans for the future. Jennifer nodded along, occasionally glancing at her phone. Neither of them seemed to know how to bridge the emotional chasm that decades of my emotional unavailability had created. "Mom," David said finally, his voice careful and measured, "we want to help, but I don't really know how. Growing up, you and Dad were so focused on your careers, your travels, your independence. You taught me that needing people was weakness, that success meant never having to rely on anyone else. Now you need help, but you've never shown me how to give it, and I've never learned how to receive it from you." His words hit me like a physical blow because they were absolutely true. I had raised him to be self-sufficient, to value achievement over emotion, to see vulnerability as failure. When he'd scraped his knee as a child, I'd handed him a bandage and told him to tough it out. When he'd struggled with math in middle school, I'd hired a tutor rather than sitting with him myself. When he'd had his heart broken in high school, I'd given him practical advice about plenty of fish in the sea, instead of holding him while he cried. I had created the very distance that now left me isolated in my old age. My pursuit of independence had been so complete, so successful, that I'd trained my own son to see emotional connection as unnecessary. The irony was devastating. I'd spent my entire life building walls to protect my freedom, and now those same walls were my prison. After they left, promising to stay in touch, with the same hollow politeness that had defined our relationship for decades, I sat in my empty house and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of my choices. I wasn't just alone because Carl had died or because I'd never had close friends. I was alone because I'd systematically dismantled every opportunity for genuine human connection in favor of maintaining my precious independence. That night, I wrote David a letter, not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter on the good stationery Carl had given me for our anniversary years ago. I poured out everything I'd never said. How sorry I was for prioritizing success over love, how I'd confused providing for him with caring for him, how my fear of vulnerability had robbed us both of the mother-son relationship we deserved. I apologized for teaching him that emotions were inconvenient, that needing people was weakness, that love was less important than achievement. I mailed the letter before I could lose my nerve, then waited. David called 2 weeks later, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I never knew you felt that way. I thought you were just satisfied with how things were." We talked for 2 hours that night. Really talked, sharing memories and regrets and hopes for whatever time we had left. It wasn't a magical healing. 43 years of emotional distance couldn't be erased in one conversation, but it was a beginning. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chan, a gentle woman who helped me understand that my pursuit of independence had been driven by fear rather than strength. Fear of being hurt, fear of being disappointed, fear of being seen as weak or needy. I'd built my entire identity around not needing anyone, but humans are wired for connection. My isolation wasn't the price of freedom, it was the cost of fear. Through therapy, I found a meditation group at the local community center. Sitting in that circle of strangers who became friends, learning to be present in each moment rather than constantly planning for the future, I discovered something I'd never experienced: peace. Not the peace of having everything under control, but the peace of accepting that control was an illusion anyway. Today, at 73, I'm learning to live differently. David and I talk every week now, And while our relationship will never be what it might have been if I'd chosen love over independence from the beginning, it's real in a way it never was before. I volunteer at a literacy program, teaching adults to read, finding purpose in connection rather than achievement. I've learned that emotional bonds matter more than financial security, that being vulnerable isn't weakness, it's the only path to genuine human connection. If you're listening to this story, drop a comment about whether you've ever chosen independence over connection, and hit that subscribe button if you believe it's never too late to choose love over fear. Moral lesson: true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts but in hearts that remember your kindness, hands that reach for yours in darkness, and souls brave enough to love despite life's inevitable losses.